Hey there! Tonight, we're not diving into tales of royalty or legends etched in stone. We're traveling to the forgotten margins of history, places untouched by oil paintings or gilded pages. This is about the other side of the medieval world, the peasants. The ones who didn't wear crowns or ride stallions. The ones who endured plagues, hunger, bitter cold, and 1,000 tiny humiliations, all without a name that would echo past their graves. No glory, no legacy, just long days, short nights, and a quiet, stubborn endurance that most of us couldn't last an hour in. If this kind of slow, grounded storytelling helps quiet your thoughts, feel free to like the video or subscribe, but only if it actually brings you a little peace. And in the comments, let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is right now. It's oddly comforting to see the different corners of the world falling asleep to the same soft narrative. So, dim the lights. Switch on a fan if you like that low hum in the background. Let the stillness settle in. Let's begin at the far edge of the known world. The village you're about to enter doesn't have a name. Or if it ever did, time stole it away. It rests in a shallow valley somewhere in the vague middle of nothing. Just a fold in the land, tucked far enough from roads or records to stay invisible. You wouldn't find it on a map, even if you had a map, which you don't. You've never even seen one. To you, the world ends where the tree line begins. The forest looms, thick and slow-moving, like something ancient that barely tolerates your presence. The fields stretch out in uneven shapes of green and brown, tilled to exhaustion, then tilled again. Somewhere north, there's a river. You've never seen it, but people talk about it like it's a saint or a dragon, real, maybe, but distant. This is where you were born. This is where you'll die. Maybe 60 paces separate the two. The homes are crooked and tired, like they've spent too many winters leaning into the wind. The walls are woven sticks, plastered with mud and straw, patched again and again with whatever the storms haven't stolen. The roofs sag under their own weight. They leak, always in the places just out of reach. The village smells like wet wool, smoke, and soil. A sour trace of livestock. A whisper of rot. None of it surprises you anymore. It's just the scent of being alive here. The road into the village isn't really a road, just two muddy grooves carved by ox carts and years. No important soul has traveled it in a generation. Maybe ever. Most days pass in quiet. Sometimes, if the wind cooperates, you'll hear the faint toll of a distant bell from another chapel far away. Otherwise, time is marked by the sun's position or the length of shadows or the way your spine starts to ache before noon. There are a dozen families, give or take. Enough to gather for feast days, to recognize every face, every voice, every complaint. Everyone knows everyone's troubles and pretends not to unless it matters. The village elder, if you can call him that, is a man named Tom. Once he spoke to a monk and now he repeats the conversation as proof of his wisdom. No one questions it. Tom's hut hasn't collapsed. His goat looks healthy. That's about as close to leadership as anyone needs. Nothing here is exact. No records, no property lines, no deeds. Boundaries are remembered as past the old elm or where the ground gets soft. Disputes are solved with a shrug, maybe a short argument, maybe a loaf of bread passed back and forth until no one remembers why they were angry. There's no school, no tavern, no inn. If a stranger shows up, people talk about it for weeks. Where'd they come from? What do they want? Are they cursed? Do they smell of salt? A newcomer is both mesmerizing and terrifying. No one really leaves either. Not truly. Travel is more myth than plan. You've heard rumors, cities where buildings are stacked 2 or 3 stories high, where people wear shoes every day. But that's fantasy, like talking animals or women who turn into birds. You can't miss what you've never known. And beyond the forest, the hills roll long and slow. The roads, if they exist, are more famous for bandits and bad luck than any promised destination. Even if you reach those far-off places, what would you do? You don't speak the dialect. You have no coins. You don't know the rules. You don't even know your own age. So you stay, because the familiar, even when it's hard, feels safer than the unknown. Your roof leaks, your stew is on day 3, and the well runs low, but you know where to find firewood. You know which neighbor might lend a tool. You know when to bring in the sheep just by the look of the sky. You wake with the light, you sleep when it fades, and you work between. It's not much, but it's life. And within that repetition, that soft, stubborn rhythm, you find peace. Not the kind that asks questions or needs answers, but the kind that fits neatly inside the view from the nearest hill. Every now and then you'll hear whispers of distant wars, or that a king has died, or a comet lit up the sky and terrified a village 3 days away. But none of it touches you. News here arrives softened, passed between too many mouths to carry urgency. It loses weight somewhere between the merchant and the shepherd's cousin. Even time moves differently here. Seasons blur, spring leaking into summer, frost hardening into winter. You don't count years. You count harvests. The dry one, the wet one, the bad one where the rye went black, the good one where the barley came in thick and even old Marjorie smiled for a week. Sometimes the steward comes around. He asks questions, counts grain, scribbles notes. You answer with care. Never too much detail. He doesn't like detail. You've never met the king. You're not sure what he does, but you say his name in prayers just in case it matters. Because here, at the edge of the map, things don't change. And when they do, it's usually for the worse. Still, the hearth glows. The roof mostly holds. The cottage is warm, and tomorrow the same sun will rise over the same hills. Hey there. Tonight, we're not entering grand halls or golden thrones, but walking through a quieter threshold into the half-forgotten shadows at the edges of time. We won't be recounting the deeds of lords or battles of kings. Instead, we're returning to the earth. To a world not recorded in books or etched into stained glass, but lived one breath, one blister, one hungry winter at a time. This is the story of the medieval peasant. The kind of story that doesn't get retold at banquets. The kind of life built not on triumph, but endurance. These were people who didn't wear crowns or carry swords, but who carried everything else: buckets of water, baskets of turnips, children through fever, grief through silence. They survived not by heroism, but by habit. No one built statues for them. No one wrote songs. But they woke up each day and did what needed doing. And somehow that was enough. If stories like this help slow your thoughts, if they feel like a gentle exhale at the end of a long day, you're welcome to like the video or subscribe. But only if it brings you calm. If it helps you breathe. And if you're listening now, let me know in the comments where you are and what time it is. It's strangely soothing to know that while one person is folding laundry in California, another is drifting off in a small flat in Glasgow, and someone else is listening in the dark stillness of rural India. All connected by the soft rhythm of a shared story. Now turn down the lights. Put on a blanket. Let the fan hum softly if you like that sound. Let your shoulders loosen, your jaw unclench. Let the noise of the day drift away, and come with me to the edge of the known world. This village, the one we're entering, doesn't have a name. Or if it once did, it was whispered too softly and too long ago. It lies in a dip between hills, in a quiet wrinkle of land that's neither remarkable nor remembered. It's not marked on any map. Not that you've ever seen a map. The world, for you, ends at the forest's edge. And that forest, it's not gentle. Not a place for fairy tales or afternoon walks. It's thick, still, watching. It moves slowly like something alive but ancient, something that knows it will outlast you. The trees are tall and tangled, the underbrush wet with silence. The kind of silence that makes you hesitate. That tells you you're a visitor, not a resident. The fields stretch in all directions, broken into awkward patches. Green, brown, gray. They're stitched together not by design, but by memory and exhaustion. They've been tilled until their breath ran out, then tilled again. They don't give easily. They never have. Somewhere, far to the north, people say there's a river. You've never seen it, but you've heard its name in the same way you hear about saints or devils, half believed, half feared. Just another mystery too distant to matter. This is where you were born. This is where you'll die. The space between might be a few dozen steps, or 1,000 small repetitions. The homes here are small and slouched, bent like old backs. Their roofs dip in places. Their walls bulge, like the wind pushed too hard for too many winters and the homes simply learn to lean with it. Walls are made of mud and sticks, wattle and daub the old way. Carefully twisted, endlessly patched. The rain eats at them. The sun cracks them. And every season you smear on more mud and pretend it's stronger than last year. The roofs are thatch, dry when they're new, heavy with water and moss not long after. They always leak. Always. And always in the same unreachable corner. The village smells like smoke, wool, earth, and something sour. Sometimes it's rot. Sometimes it's just the air settling into itself. You stop noticing after a while. It becomes the scent of home. There's a path leading in, but calling it a road would be generous. Just a pair of ruts carved into the mud, deep enough to collect rainwater and mosquitoes. Important people don't travel here. Important people likely don't know it exists. Most days, life moves slowly. You rise with the sun, not because you choose to, but because that's when the cold leaves the blankets. You eat what's left. You work. You wait. If the wind is just right, you might hear a chapel bell from a village you've never seen. If not, you measure time by the shadows on your floor or the way your knees ache before noon. There are a dozen families here, maybe a few more. Enough to fill the space around a bonfire on feast days. Enough to know each other's names, voices, arguments. You know who lost a chicken, who was bred, who isn't speaking to whom. But you keep your mouth shut unless the silence becomes too heavy. The closest thing to a leader is Tom. He's old, has a goat that looks healthier than most. He once talked to a monk and has been living off that wisdom ever since. No one argues. His hut hasn't fallen down yet. That's leadership enough. Nothing here is written. There are no deeds, no maps, no ink-stained records. Land is defined by memory, past the hollow tree or where the stones start to turn white. If there's a disagreement, it's settled with a few words and maybe a shared crust of bread. If that doesn't work, people just wait until they're too tired to care. There's no inn, no tavern, no school. If a stranger arrives, it's the news of the year. Where did they come from? Do they carry disease? Are they cursed? Do they smell of the sea? People don't just pass through. And no one leaves. Not for real. You've heard of cities. Places where the buildings are tall and made of stone, where people walk streets that stay streets, even in the rain. But those are bedtime stories. Like winged horses or magic apples. You can't long for what you've never seen. The woods are dense. The roads, if they exist, are whispered about like riddles. Bandits live there. Or ghosts. Or worse, officials with questions. You wouldn't know how to travel even if you wanted to. You don't have coins. You don't speak the dialects. You don't even know the names of the stars. So you stay, because staying means knowing. Knowing which patch of roof needs patching, which corner of the shed the cat sleeps in, which hill gives the best view of the storm coming. Your life moves in loops. You wake. You fetch water. You weed the garden. You check the goat. You mend what broke. You eat what's left. You go to sleep hoping nothing leaks. Then you do it again. It's not exciting, but it's yours. And in that sameness, something ancient hums. Not happiness, maybe, but steadiness. A slow drumbeat of being. You don't need to understand why the stars move. You just need to know which one tells you it's almost time to bring the sheep in. You hear rumors, distant kings, strange wars, comets that frightened a village a week's walk away. But none of it ever reaches you directly. The urgency thins as it travels, losing weight with every telling. By the time it reaches your ears, it's barely more than smoke. Even the seasons blur. Spring melts into summer. Winter arrives like a drunk guest, early, loud, and unwelcome. You don't mark years. You mark barley. The bad one. The better one. The one where Marjorie smiled for 3 days straight. Sometimes a steward arrives. He writes things down. Asks questions with too much care. You answer without saying too much. He doesn't like detail. You don't trust him anyway. You've never met the king. You say his name when you pray because you were told it matters. You're not sure if it does. Because here, on the outer edge of memory, nothing much changes. And when it does, it's usually not for the better. But still, the fire catches. The roof holds mostly. The cottage is warmer than the wind outside. And tomorrow, the sun will rise over the same hills it always has. Most people in the medieval countryside never strayed far from where they were born. Not because they were lazy. Not because they lacked imagination or courage. But because the world beyond the horizon didn't feel like it belonged to them. It was too large, too uncertain, too full of questions they'd never been taught to ask. You might walk hundreds of miles in your life, but almost all of it would be in circles. From the well to the field. From the woods to the chapel. From your own front door to your neighbor's collapsing fence and back again. You didn't travel. You didn't go on journeys. You moved. Slowly. Repetitively. Reliably. Not because you were small-minded, but because you were rooted. And in a world that didn't offer much in the way of safety, roots were everything. You grew up learning every dip and ridge of the path to the stream. Every twisted stump that marked the boundary between your family's plot and the neighbor's goats. You knew which patches of mud meant someone had passed that way recently and who it was by the size and shape of the print they left behind. Everything beyond that narrow radius began to feel theoretical. The next village might only be a few miles away, but to you it may as well have been a foreign kingdom. You heard stories about it, who married whom, who stole a sheep, who said the priest snored through mass, but you hadn't seen it. And you probably never would, because travel, real travel, was dangerous. Not exciting dangerous, not adventurous dangerous. Just exhausting, unpredictable, possibly fatal. The roads weren't really roads, not in the way we imagine them now. No smooth stones, no painted signs, no friendly inns with warm bread and a place to rest. Instead, they were narrow, muddy tracks winding through woods and over hills marked only by vague advice like, walk until you see the leaning pine, or turn left at the rock that looks like a sleeping pig. If you got lost, there were no maps to help you. No one to come looking. No way to send word. You couldn't just follow a river and hope to reach a village. You could walk for days and see no one. Your body could disappear into the brambles like it had never existed. People wouldn't even realize you were missing until the next saint's day. when your absence was noted and met with nothing more than a shrug. He must have gone beyond the trees, they'd say. And somehow that explained everything. And the forest, oh, the forest wasn't kind. Medieval forests weren't romantic. They weren't quiet havens with golden leaves and curious deer. They were dense, choked with thorns and roots, damp and disorienting, filled with sounds that didn't belong to anything you could name. You moved through them like a trespasser, like something not quite welcome. There were boars, wolves, things with claws and teeth and desperation in their bones. And worse, there were people. People who didn't want to be found, who had nothing left to lose. Bandits who lived outside the system on the scraps of others and who watched the roads for movement, especially the kind that walked with a purpose, the kind that looked like they might be carrying coin, or bread, or anything else worth stealing. A man walking alone might be robbed. A woman walking alone might never be heard from again. Travelers were targets, not heroes, not pilgrims, just moving opportunities. Even confidence didn't help. People learned quickly that a strong stride wasn't armor. A brave face didn't stop a blade. The safest way to travel was not to. Then there were the practical matters. Who would tend your field while you were gone? Who would feed the animals? What if the steward arrived looking for taxes and you weren't there to answer? Absence wasn't an excuse. The ledger didn't care where you'd gone. If you missed your duties, you'd be fined. Or worse, your animals might be taken, your tools seized, your name scratched out and replaced. And even if you did make it to another village, what then? You weren't expected. You weren't welcomed. Outsiders meant trouble. They meant illness, theft, odd ideas. You might speak a slightly different dialect, hold your spoon the wrong way, refer to saints in the wrong order. And beds were already full. Food was already scarce. Hospitality wasn't a guarantee. It was a negotiation, a gamble. So you stayed. Not because you were fearful, though sometimes you were, but because you had responsibilities. You had a fence to fix, a niece to look after, a sick goat, a bit of barley drying on a sack in the sun, a dozen small tasks that needed doing before the light faded, that always needed doing. And the truth is, you didn't need the world to be bigger than it was. Your village had enough. Enough gossip, enough conflict, enough surprise. It had arguments about chickens and the occasional curse muttered over a bad trade. It had whispered love affairs and loudly misplaced tools. It had laughter and fever and storms that bent the trees sideways. It had days so quiet you could hear bread crack open in the oven. It had the rhythm of bells and the repetition of weather and the quiet pride of surviving something very small but very hard. Some nights you dreamed of seeing what was beyond the forest, what a castle looked like up close, what salt tasted like before it melted into stew. But most nights you just hoped the wind wouldn't blow the shutters open again, that the fire would still be burning when you woke, that the stew wouldn't stick while you fetched water. The village was enough, not because it was comfortable, but because it was known. And yes, some people did leave, usually the desperate, sometimes the reckless, occasionally the brave or foolish or young enough to believe the road owed them something. A boy might leave in search of work or adventure or a cause worth bleeding for. Sometimes he came back with a limp or a story or nothing at all. And when he didn't return, people just shook their heads. He went past the trees, they'd say. That was enough. Because for those who stayed, life was small, but it was shared. You weren't lonely, exactly. You shared your space with parents, siblings, cousins, animals, and the land itself. You knew how the light shifted through the rafters in summer. You knew which part of the path froze first in winter. You knew what silence meant and what it didn't. You didn't need to see a distant city to understand longing. You didn't need a fine cloak to feel pride. You didn't need to taste cinnamon to know what sweetness was, or travel across a kingdom to feel love, or boredom, or loss. And as the years went on and the joints stiffened and the children grew taller than the gateposts, the thought of leaving stopped feeling like a possibility and started to feel like a misunderstanding. Something meant for someone else, not you. You were meant to stay, and there was no shame in that, because home wasn't just a place. It was a rhythm, a pact, a story written slowly and stubbornly into the soil. And if you ever looked up at the horizon and wondered what was out there, you'd still bring in the chickens first. You'd still stir the stew. You'd still pull your shawl tighter and nod to your neighbor. Because hope doesn't always come as movement. Sometimes it comes as stillness. And staying was its own kind of courage. There is no blueprint, no architect, no waiting stack of planks with instructions burned into the side. No blueprint for your house, because your house is not a plan. It is a negotiation. A compromise between shelter and weather, between effort and decay, between your needs and the land's reluctant permission to meet them. You begin with what you have. Always. Never with what you want. The frame comes first. Rough-cut timbers from the nearest patch of woods, felled with tools older than memory, handed down across generations, each handle worn smooth with labor. The wood is never straight. It twists. It bows. It splits if the weather's wrong. You learn not to mind, because your walls will bend too. You build the frame like you live your life, slowly, repeatedly, with no illusions of permanence. Then comes the wattle, the weave of flexible sticks between the upright posts. Thin branches, gathered and soaked until pliable, then threaded like a basket through the waiting structure. It takes time. Time you don't have, but give anyway. Because without it, there's no home at all. After that comes the daub, a slurry of mud, straw, manure, and water mixed by hand, foot, or whatever happens to be nearby. It clings mostly. Sometimes it falls. You slap it on, press it in, smooth it with your palm, and hope it holds through the next rain. It never dries evenly. Cracks form as soon as the sun hits it. In the worst years, whole chunks fall away overnight. You patch, and patch, and patch again. Eventually, it stops smelling like earth and dung. Or rather, you stop noticing. The roof is thatch. Always thatch. Bundles of dried straw tied tightly to rafters, layered like scales. When it's new, it glows golden in the light, almost beautiful in its uniformity. When it's old, it sags and grays, weighed down with rain, shadowed by rot. Birds nest in it. Mice make homes. Holes open where you least expect them. You start to keep a bucket near your bed, not for washing, but for catching the drips. You don't seal it. You don't shingle it. You just keep patching it until it's more patch than roof. And then you patch the patch. The floor is dirt. Not symbolic dirt, actual dirt. You tell yourself it's firm, and it is. Sort of. Years of sweeping, stomping, spilling have turned it into something close to solid. But when it rains, it softens again. When it freezes, it cracks. When the animals come inside for the night, it becomes a guessing game of what you're stepping on. You might spread rushes or old straw. It helps for a while. Then it turns to dust. Then you sweep it out and do it again. Or you don't. Eventually the straw becomes the floor and you accept it. Like so many things. The windows, if they can be called that, are gaps in the wall, sometimes covered with shutters that creak on bent hinges and rarely close completely. There's no glass. That's for the wealthy or the church. Air comes in. Light comes in. Cold comes in. And sometimes so do the chickens. There's one door. Maybe 2 if you're lucky or ambitious. It's hung crooked because the wood swelled last winter. It latches with a stick, a loop of rope, a stone, whatever works. Not to keep people out. There's nothing to steal. Just to keep the wind from tearing it open. Inside, there's 1 room. Maybe 2 if someone managed to build a lean-to off the side or a loft over the beams. But usually just 1. 1 space where you cook, eat, sleep, mend, argue, forgive, and wait for spring. Everyone lives here. Parents, children, grandparents, maybe a cousin whose mother died, maybe a neighbor's boy sent over during the last sickness, maybe a girl no one talks about too much. There's no privacy and no expectation of it. Just bodies and breath and the creaking rhythm of a shared life. At the center is the hearth. If you're fortunate, it's built of stone. If not, it's clay and prayer. Smoke rises through a hole in the roof more or less. There's no chimney. Not yet. Not here. So the air inside is always tinged with wood smoke. It stings the eyes in winter and stains the rafters black. Still, it's warm. Mostly. Enough. The fire is everything. It's heat, light, cooking, comfort, protection. You guard it like a treasure. You feed it with dry twigs and secrets. You bank it before bed and whisper to it in the morning. Sometimes you talk to it when no one else is awake. Around the fire, there's a bench, a table, maybe a stool with 1 leg shorter than the others. Maybe a chest carved if your grandfather had talent, borrowed if he didn't. Furniture isn't bought. It's inherited, cobbled together, or married into. Beds are wooden frames or straw pallets, often shared. Sometimes by choice, usually by necessity. You sleep beside your sister, your child, your grandfather, your goat. The blankets are wool, rough and never fully dry. You layer them like promises. They hold in the heat mostly, enough to make it through the night. There's storage in the rafters. Garlic, onions, herbs strung together in crumbling clusters. Maybe a bit of smoked meat wrapped in cloth. You know how low your stores are by the scent in the air. Rich in winter, faint by spring. You can smell scarcity before you taste it. Animals are not separate from your life. They are inside it. Literally. The cow sleeps in the far corner beside the wall. Chickens find spots beneath the table. A goat huddles near the door. It isn't ideal. It isn't sanitary, but it's warm. And you grow used to the sounds, the shifting hooves, the occasional soft cluck, the sudden startle of a bleat in the dark. They become background noise, like the wind in the thatch, like your own breath. Nothing is level. The floor dips. The roof leans. The walls breathe in and out with the seasons. The whole place seems to shift just slightly, like it's alive. Like it's adapting too. You fix what you can. You ignore what you can't. You swear every spring to fix the back wall. You say it aloud. Everyone nods. But come autumn, it's still leaning. Still holding. Just barely. This isn't a house built to last. It's a house built to endure. And yet, for all its flaws, for all its drafts and stains and uneven bones, it's home. You know where the cold comes in and how to block it with an old sack. You know which beam can hold the pot and which one creaks if you hang a lantern too close. You know where the dog curls up when the wind howls and how the light falls through the slats just before dusk. A stranger would see poverty. You see practice, ingenuity, perseverance. A roof that hasn't caved in is a win. A fire that lights on the first try is a gift. A dry corner is a blessing. You count these victories quietly without celebration. At the end of the day, you lie down surrounded by straw and smoke and familiar weight. You don't call it comfort, but it is, in a way that matters. Not pride exactly, but presence. This is your space. It leans, it creaks, it bends with the wind, but it holds. And so do you. For a medieval peasant, food wasn't a pleasure. It wasn't a celebration. It wasn't something to anticipate or plan around. It was a question that needed answering every single day. A problem that returned with the same urgency and the same limitations. You didn't eat to enjoy. You ate to not be hungry anymore. Your kitchen, if you could call it that, was nothing like a modern one. There were no cupboards, no shelves lined with spices, no jars filled with dried beans and herbs. There was no counter to chop on, no sink to rinse vegetables, no window to look out of while you stirred. Your kitchen was a corner of the house, near the fire, near the pot. You had a pot, a ladle, maybe a knife, a wooden bowl, and a fire that never fully went out. That was the extent of your culinary domain. Everything else was improvised. At the heart of your meals was something called pottage. It wasn't a recipe, it was a strategy. A method of survival disguised as a stew. It lived in the pot, sometimes for days, sometimes for weeks, never truly empty and never entirely fresh. You didn't cook pottage. You maintained it. You added to it, stirred it, ladled from it, scraped the sides, and hoped no strange molds grew in it overnight. The ingredients depended entirely on what you had, which usually wasn't much. On a good day, you might find cabbage, leeks, barley, or dried legumes tossed in. Maybe garlic or onions if the harvest had been kind. On a bad day, the pot held mostly water and memory. Meat, if you had it, was more often bone than flesh. A single bone could last a week, boiled repeatedly, each day drawing out just a little more of its fading strength, hoping that the flavor might linger like a ghost haunting the broth. The taste was dull. Not savory, not spicy, not satisfying, just warm. But warm was enough. Pottage wasn't something you looked forward to, but it filled your belly, and that was the measure of success. The pot itself was never clean. It was wiped, occasionally scraped, rarely scrubbed. The next batch always carried hints of the last, each meal echoing the ones before. You tasted continuity more than variety. Bread was the other anchor of your diet. Not soft, not golden, not airy. Medieval bread was dense, hard, and often blackened on the bottom. It was made with rye or barley or oats, coarse flours that didn't rise much and didn't soften over time. Wheat, pale and fine, belonged to the upper classes. You might see it once in your life. You would likely never taste it. The loaves were small, heavy, and quick to crumble. If left out for a day, they turned from food to weapon. But they filled your stomach, and they soaked up stew. Sometimes bread was made from desperation, a chaff, husks, ground up peas, whatever could be scavenged from the miller's barrel. In times of true scarcity, even bark was ground and baked. Not metaphorical bark, real bark, peeled, soaked, and ground into famine bread. Bitter, tough, almost inedible, but it kept you alive. Technically, protein was rare, extremely rare. You didn't eat your animals unless you had no other choice. Chickens laid eggs. Cows gave milk. Goats gave both. Eating one meant losing everything it might still produce. When you did eat meat, every part was used: fat, blood, organs, bones. The blood became pudding. The fat was rendered and saved. The head became soup. Nothing was wasted. Not ever. Pigs were the most common source of meat, but even they weren't slaughtered lightly. A single pig meant weeks of salting, drying, hanging. It required planning and cooperation. It wasn't dinner, it was a season. If you lived near water, you might fish. But rivers and lakes were often owned by lords, and fishing without permission could lead to punishment. You caught what you could: eels, river fish, the occasional frog. Salted herring, if acquired through trade, was a treasured gift. It might make you weep just from the scent. Religion dictated your plate, too. On Fridays and during Lent, meat was forbidden. You pivoted to fish or went without. In creative moments, beaver tails were declared fish by the church, a theological loophole embraced by hungry bellies. Milk was fragile. It spoiled fast. If you didn't drink it immediately, you turned it into butter or cheese. Butter was a luxury, rarely abundant, used sparingly and with reverence. Cheese was hard, tangy, dry. If you had a few rounds stored on a shelf, it meant your cow had been generous and your household lucky. Dairy didn't always sit well. Stomachs turned, but you drank it anyway. Sour milk could still be used in cooking. Rancid butter was spread thin and prayed over. Moldy cheese was trimmed, sniffed, and hoped against. You ate what you could. Water wasn't always safe to drink. Streams could be clear and deadly at once. So you drank ale. Weak ale. Small beer, they called it. Brewed at home, consumed by everyone, including children. It had just enough alcohol to kill bacteria and just enough taste to feel different from water. It didn't make you drunk, just a little quieter. If you had apples or pears, you made cider. Wine was for the nobility. Meat was rare. Milk was for the sick and young. For everyone else, ale with breakfast, ale with lunch, and ale to soften the edges of sleep. Vegetables formed the base of your meals: cabbage, onions, garlic, turnips, leeks. Carrots too, though not the bright orange kind. Medieval carrots came in whites, purples, and dark roots that looked more like misshapen tubers. You used every part: root, stalk, leaf. Nothing was discarded. Peels were fed to animals or tossed in the fire. You boiled tops into greens. You composted what you couldn't chew. Fruit was rare and seasonal. Apples mostly. Maybe wild berries. If you dried them, they lasted the winter. If you didn't, you ate them all at once and remembered the taste until next year. Preserving was difficult. Sugar was practically unheard of. Honey, if you kept bees, was a treasure more than a sweetener. Meals were eaten together, sitting on benches or stones or the floor. There were no courses, no sequences, no service. Just a pot, a bit of bread, and the hope that it would be enough. You didn't complain. Complaining didn't thicken the stew. If you had a feast, a wedding, a saint's day, a harvest celebration, you might roast a bird. You might make a pie, not a flaky, buttery pastry. A medieval pie was a crust of hard dough meant to hold meat, sometimes heavily spiced. Pepper if you had it, ginger or cinnamon if you were lucky, or if someone had traded well at market. But most days weren't feast days. Most days were quiet. Stew, bread, ale. You scraped your bowl. You leaned back against the wall and listened to the pot bubble again. You counted how many meals you had left before you needed to grind more grain. You watched the same hands make the same movements near the same fire. You ate because you were alive. And being alive meant eating again tomorrow. If you were a medieval peasant, you didn't really own anything. Not in the way we think of ownership. You might live on a piece of land. You might build a house with your own hands. You might raise chickens, shear sheep, dig furrows deep into soil that had known your family for generations. But none of it truly belonged to you. Not the soil. Not the roof above your head. Not even, in some abstract way, your own labor. It all belonged to the Lord. Not a king, not some far-off crown on a coin, but your local Lord. The man who lived on the hill or across the river in a larger house with straighter walls and a roof that didn't leak. A man who didn't know your name but knew your number, how many sacks of grain you owed, how many eggs your hens might produce this season, whether your son had reached working age yet. He owned the land. And by owning the land, he owned what was on it, including you, in a sense. You were a villain. That's not an insult. It was a classification. You were bound to the land. You couldn't sell it. You couldn't leave it. You couldn't even pass it to your children without permission. You worked it, but you didn't control it. And you owed more than just gratitude for being allowed to stay. You owed labor. You owed taxes. You owed obedience. It wasn't a relationship. It was a structure. You rarely spoke to the Lord himself. You spoke to his steward, or his reeve, or his bailiff. Men who carried wax tablets and an air of indifference. Men who asked questions you couldn't afford to answer too honestly. Men who wrote things down carefully. Permanently. Labor came first. A few days a week or more during harvest, you were expected to work the Lord's land, not your own. This was called corvée labor. You were given no wage, no thanks. Just the knowledge that someone in the manor would eat well tonight, and you had helped make that possible. It was not optional. Then came the taxes. And they came in every shape. A portion of your grain. A measure of your wool. A chicken here, some eggs there. If you brewed ale, you owed ale. If your sow gave birth, you owed piglets. If you caught fish, you paid with fish. Even the river, after all, belonged to someone. And the taxes didn't end with goods. If you wanted to use the mill, you paid. Even though it was the only way to grind your grain. Even though the mill was built with your labor, operated by your neighbor, and stood next to the stream that ran through your father's field. Still, you paid. Grinding your own grain by hand might seem like an alternative. But in many places, that was illegal. Because the Lord didn't just want his share, he wanted control. Same with the oven. Many villages had a communal oven owned by the manor. You paid to bake your bread. If you tried to do it at home and got caught, there could be consequences. Fines. Punishments. Shame. Even your celebrations were taxed. Getting married? There's a fee. Inheriting your father's strip of field? A fee. Moving to another village? First you ask permission. Then you pay another fee. Every milestone had a cost. Your livestock could be taxed. Your tools. In some places, even your right to breed animals required approval. So what did you get in return? In theory, protection. The Lord had men at arms. If bandits came, or if war spilled into your valley, they would defend the land. Not for your sake, of course, but for theirs. And you lived on it, so you benefited. Sort of. In times of famine, the Lord might release some grain from storage. He might not. If he did, it was never free. And it was rarely enough. The manor court settled disputes. If your neighbor's goat wandered into your cabbages, or if someone accused you of stealing firewood, you could appear before the Lord's representative. Again, not for free. This was feudalism. A web of obligations dressed up as order. A system of ownership where ownership never really trickled down. Everything flowed upward: grain, labor, deference, silence. The manor itself was separate. Not just in structure, but in spirit. It might stand on a hill looking down at your crooked home. It was made of stone or thick timber with deep thatch and narrow windows. Inside, it smelled of beeswax and meat. Tapestries on the walls. Heavy tables. A hearth the size of your entire house. Meals served on trenchers with spices you couldn't name. The Lord wore wool lined with fur. His boots were leather, not patched burlap. He had servants. He had a bed to himself. He might not think of you at all, but he knew how much you owed him. It was recorded. Not by you couldn't read, but by others. The steward, the reeve, the bailiff. Men with ink-stained fingers and thin lips. Men who asked questions in the spring and returned in the fall. Men who measured your debts like they were measuring grain. If you couldn't pay, the punishments varied. More labor, more goods taken, fines added to fines. In worse cases, your tools could be seized, your animals taken, your land reclaimed, your house such as it was emptied. Dignity was a luxury you couldn't afford and often weren't allowed. You didn't rebel. Not really. Because rebellion wasn't brave, it was foolish. You'd heard stories. Everyone had. A cousin whipped. A neighbor vanished. A family exiled because they refused to hand over the last goose. And the system, cruel though it was, offered a kind of stability. You knew what was expected. You knew what you owed. There were rules. Harsh, yes, but consistent. And when the rules were clear, survival was possible. And sometimes, rarely, the Lord gave something back. A feast day when food was distributed. A tax waived during a particularly bad harvest. A kind word from horseback. Not enough to undo the weight, but enough to keep it from crushing you entirely. The relationship wasn't friendly, but it was familiar. Your Lord might be kind. He might be cruel. He might never be seen at all. But he was above you. Always. You bowed when he passed. You removed your cap. You used the right titles. Not because he earned them, but because not using them meant trouble. And maybe, just maybe, somewhere in your heart there was a small spark of hope. That one day you might be noticed, rewarded, lifted, even if only a little. It almost never happened. But hope was stubborn. It had to be. Because as the steward kept walking, the reeve kept writing, and the mill kept grinding, you kept digging. You put your hands in the soil. You planted. You harvested. You endured. There was no retirement, no promotion, no freedom earned through service. Just the quiet satisfaction of having done what was asked, of having survived another year beneath the weight of someone else's title. As long as the Lord was pleased, you were allowed to go on living. When you're a medieval peasant, time doesn't move in straight lines. It loops. It folds. It repeats. The calendar isn't something you hang on a wall, it's something you feel in your bones. In the ache of your shoulders. In the softness of the ground. In the way the wind changes its voice. You don't mark time by dates. You mark it by patterns. The year unfolds like a circle, not a ladder. Spring becomes summer, becomes harvest, becomes winter, becomes waiting, becomes spring again. It never feels like a new beginning, just another pass through the same motions. Another orbit around the same responsibilities. You don't celebrate your birthday. You might not even know the day you were born. No one wrote it down. It wasn't marked. You age it in seasons, not years. She was born the winter the thatch caved in. He came just before the early barley. That's how time clings to memory. The year is broken into two parts, when the earth gives and when it doesn't. Spring is a slow return. The thaw comes not as a miracle, but as a reluctant mercy. The earth softens like a sigh. You poke seeds into the mud with frozen fingers. You coax life back into the land and hope it forgives you for what you asked of it last year. Nothing is guaranteed. A late frost can kill everything. One bad storm can drown the field you spent a week digging. You don't trust spring until you see green. Summer is labor. Long days. Short sleep. Sweat stinging your eyes. Bent backs and dirty knees. You rise before the sun and return home after it sets. You chase time. Always time. Because weeds don't wait. Because sheep wander. Because storms roll in fast and you're always behind. You measure success not in abundance, but in enough. Enough to eat. Enough to store. Enough to trade. enough to make it through what comes next. Autumn is fear wrapped in gratitude. Harvest comes, and with it hope measured in baskets, bushels, sacks. You bring in everything you can. You dry it, salt it, hang it, hide it from rats. You whisper to it like it's a sleeping child. Please last. Please be enough. Please carry us. But even a full cellar doesn't quiet your worry. Because winter is already on its way. Winter is not a season. It's an adversary. It doesn't care if you're ready. It doesn't care if you're tired. It arrives like a slow knife, slipping into your days, shortening them, dimming the light, hardening the ground. You learn to stretch, to make do, to ration. Bread gets thinner. Stew gets weaker. Fires burn lower. You sleep longer, not out of luxury, but to use less energy. Hunger becomes normal. Cold becomes a companion. You stop complaining because everyone else is cold too. Illness visits more often. Coughs deepen. Skin cracks. Old wounds reopen. People get quieter. A neighbor disappears for a few days and then reappears with a limp or not at all. Babies born in winter are either strong or very, very unlucky. Death comes softly in winter. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just a slowing, a quiet, a stopped breath in the night. You wake to silence and know someone is gone. Still, you press on. The church helps anchor the year. Saints' days, feast days, holy days, days when work pauses or is supposed to, days when bread is shared a little wider and ale flows a little freer. Not because life is easy, but because it's hard and people need moments to look forward to. The church calendar becomes your clock. Lent, Advent, Michaelmas, Epiphany. You don't always understand the meanings, but you know the rhythms. You fast when told. You feast when allowed. You kneel when bells ring. Mass is in Latin, a language that rolls past your ears like water over stone. You don't understand the words, but the tone is familiar. The priest speaks. You bow your head. The incense burns. The candles flicker. Your soul feels quiet. Even if nothing is solved, time is marked in other ways too. The first frost. The last egg. The morning the sheep don't rise. The day your child speaks their first word. The day your neighbor forgets yours. You count time by the way people change, by the way someone's hands shake more, or how your own steps slow. You notice when the bread takes longer to rise or the fire needs more coaxing. There are festivals, not the kind with fireworks or parades, but the kind with bonfires and music played on strings stretched over hollow gourds. The kind with dancing that is more stomping than grace. The kind with laughter that sounds like relief. You were your best, still patched, still faded, but whole. You eat more than usual. You let your children stay up late. You let yourself smile fully for once. Then, the next day, it's back to the fields. Time is also kept in scars. The thin line on your hand from last year's scythe. The healed rib from when the cow kicked. The old ache in your knee from falling off the wall during that icy winter. You were your history, not in photographs or journals, but in bruises and memories passed quietly across stew pots and evening fires. Children learn time from you, not from clocks, but from your voice. From how you say, not yet, the soil's still hard, or soon the geese will fly. They learn that shadows move in a pattern. That hunger always visits in February. That the birds returning means you can plant again. Even dreams come in cycles. You don't dream of next year. You dream of the next harvest. The next dry stretch. The next storm. You live inside a clock made of sky. You know when the wind changes. You know when the moon feels too full. You know when the fire needs more wood just by how your toes curl in the blanket. And sometimes when the night is clear and the air is still and the world stops just long enough to exhale, you feel outside of time. Just for a breath. You feel like maybe, just maybe, the world is turning with you, not against you. Then a baby cries. The fire hisses. The roof creaks. And still, despite everything, the cold, the hunger, the weight of obligation, you find ways to make beauty. Not grand beauty. Not the kind found in paintings or tapestries or golden cathedrals. But quiet beauty. Beauty woven into the cracks of ordinary life. You hum when you work. Old songs passed from lips to ears for generations, each verse shifting slightly like a stone smoothed by time. Songs about the weather, about lost love, about saints and foolish goats. No one remembers who first sang them. No one needs to. You decorate your tools. A carved line on the handle. A wrapped cord dyed with crushed berries. Not because it makes the hodig better, but because it makes it yours. You mend clothes with thread in mismatched colors. Sometimes out of necessity. Sometimes for the joy of seeing something bright against the dull wool. You wear your repairs like badges. This tear from harvest. This hole from chasing the pig. This patch from the night you fell asleep too close to the fire. Children play, even in the mud, even with sticks, even after working in the fields. They chase chickens. They build castles out of stones. They laugh so loudly that it startles the birds. Laughter, it turns out, needs no coin. On feast days, you dance. Awkwardly, joyfully. You grip hands and spin and stomp until your feet ache and your ribs hurt from smiling. There's no stage, no audience, just bodies and breath and music made from whatever instruments survived the last winter. You paint symbols on the door with chalk when the new year arrives. You leave flowers on the graves of those who no longer rise with the sun. You whisper blessings into the wind before a storm. You don't have art as a profession, but you have art as a survival instinct. Stories are everywhere. At night, by the fire, you tell tales. Not written, not perfect, but vivid, alive. Stories about saints who outwitted devils, about animals who spoke truth, about lost villages under the hills, about ghosts who asked for nothing but to be remembered. Some stories are warnings. Some are prayers in disguise. Some are just excuses to stay awake a little longer before the cold sleep of night. There is no literacy, but there is memory. And memory holds everything. The shape of your father's laugh. The warmth of your mother's hands. The way your sister danced once, only once, under a summer rain. You carry these like sacred relics. Not in boxes or books, but in the soft spaces behind your eyes. You love. Fiercely, without flourish, not with poetry, but with gestures. You save the last crust of bread. You pull the blanket a little higher over their shoulder. You touch their back in the dark just to make sure they're breathing. You marry not for wealth or strategy, but for steadiness. For the shared understanding of toil. For the shared roof that leaks. For the shared hope that the next harvest won't betray you. And when grief comes, and it does, it sits beside you like an old friend. You don't fight it. You make it tea. You let it walk the fields with you. You speak its name aloud so it knows it's not alone. When someone dies, the village bends around the loss. Not dramatically, but with presence. A quiet that settles deeper than usual. Bread delivered without words. Tasks taken over silently. A candle left burning longer than needed. No one forgets. Not really. The dead linger in habits, in sayings, in the way the door creaks or how someone else stirs the pot now. Absence doesn't erase. It echoes. And so life continues. You plant again. You mend again. You sing again. Not because you've healed, but because the rhythm demands it. And in rare moments, when the sun hits just right, when the work is done for the day, when the air is soft and the shadows long, you feel something like peace. You stand in your doorway, hands on your hips, the dust of the field still clinging to your boots. You look out at the crooked fences, the tired trees, the children chasing each other around the well. And you think it's not much, but it's enough. Your life won't be recorded. There will be no paintings, no statues, no epic sung in your name. But your life matters, deeply, because it held up the world. While kings warred and popes plotted and cities burned and borders shifted, you kept going. You woke up. You did the work. You loved quietly. You suffered without spectacle. You made something from almost nothing. And that's a kind of heroism no ballad could contain. So tonight, as you lie down on your straw mattress, with the fire dimming and the wind rattling the shutters, let yourself feel proud. Not for glory, but for presence. You were here. You endured. You mattered. And in the grand, chaotic, fragile story of being human, that is enough. Let sleep take you now. Let the worries of the day slip like mist from your chest. You are safe. You are still. The work is done for now. And tomorrow will come as it always has. With light. With bread. With breath. Good night.